The average snake sheds its skin somewhere between 4 and 12 times annually. They shed their entire outer layer of skin because their body has outgrown the old skin and because they need to rid their body of the parasites that attach to them while they slither around. The process can take up to a week and starts with the snake's skin turning a bluish color and their eyes getting a little cloudy. Then the snake will rub their head on a rough surface to tear open the loosening skin, and they'll start wriggling their way out of it and leave it behind. The shedded skin is often twice as long as the snake's body, actually, because the skin layer lost comes from both the top and the bottom of each individual scale. Experts in snakes, called ophiologists, ophiology being the branch of herpetology that is the study of snakes, tell us that we should not mess with snakes when they're shedding their skins. I mean, there are probably quite a few of us who don't want to mess with snakes anyway at any time, but in particular, we shouldn't try to help them along when they are shedding their skins. And there are two primary reasons for that. One is that it's a natural process and it doesn't need any help. Snakes have been doing it for millennia. They will continue to do it for millennia. It doesn't need any human intervention. The other, though, is that skin shedding is extremely stressful for the snake, and messing with the snake amplifies the stress and could result in complications, health complications for the snake, including death. But without shedding their skin, snakes would never grow, and the parasites that attach to them would cause untold illnesses. The stress of molting is worth it and necessary for the snake. Ministry is my third career. My first was in nonprofit program management. I worked for nearly 2 decades in domestic violence and sexual assault prevention. I managed 2 programs in 2 large communities during that time, not the same time, but I loved that work. I really did, and I was actually really good at it. My second career, the one that is sunsetting right now as I'm nearly finished with seminary, is working in faculty academic affairs at the University of Michigan. Each shift to a new career has been a molting for me. I was letting go of old skin that wasn't right anymore and needed to be shed in order for me to grow. I needed to be done with domestic violence and sexual assault work, even though I loved it, because the work is not sustainable. The pay isn't great, even for managers, and the work is relentlessly stressful. And in my case, I also had an hour commute each way, which could stretch to several hours on a bad day. And that was actually quite literally probably taking years off of my life. I really needed to shed that skin. I found a transition into higher education administration that was well suited for the relationship building skills I had developed in my years at a nonprofit. This is sustainable work in the sense that it pays well, supports me as a whole person, and is nearly never stressful. Or perhaps my time working in a relentlessly stressful environment taught me the difference between urgency and emergency in such a way that a faculty hiring deadline just doesn't stress me out. But ministry is a calling. And I'd been hearing the call for years and years, but I didn't know how to become. When I was trying to do that and hear the call and identify it and know what it was, a friend of mine who'd also heard the call shared a poem called Calling by Nancy Schaefer. And I'd like to share it with you now. When you heard that voice and knew it finally called for you and what it was saying, where were you? Were you in the shower, wet and soapy, or chopping cabbage late for dinner? Were you planting radish seeds or seeking one last sock? Maybe wiping handprints off a window or coaxing words into a sentence, or coming upon a hyacinth or one last no. Where were you when you heard that ancient voice And did yes get born right then? And did you weep? Had it called you since before you even were? And when you knew that, did your joy escape all holding? Where were you when you heard that calling voice? And how, in that moment, did you mark it? How ever after are you changed? Tell us, please, all you can about that voice. Teach us how to listen, how to hear. As I said, I'd heard the voice all along, even though I didn't know what it meant yet, in much the same way that a snake is compelled to rub their head against a rock to shed the old skin. That snake is compelled to do that all the time. Well, 4 to 12 times a year. Our theme for this month is becoming, and we become all the time. Some of our becomings are as monumental as a snake shedding their skin or my discernment toward becoming a minister, and some are less so, but none of them can be rushed. I bet, and I heard before worship started, that some of you are gardeners and you are currently doing some of the prep work for that this summer, getting ready to plant with seed starts and whatnot. My true confession, I am not a gardener. I don't actually have any curiosity about it, but I understand gardening to some extent. And I know that you can't force a seed to sprout faster. It takes time, and it takes the time it needs. And no matter how many times you look at it, poke it, or expect it, the sprout and the subsequent plant will happen in their own due time. So many things in life take the time they need and don't respond to rushing. In the pandemic, there have been a lot of people who've never baked before trying baking out. And there are people I know in my life who are that way. And also folks who've always been bakers and have just been baking more. I've done a little bit myself. And I have a friend who in particular has been experimenting with no knead bread during the pandemic. And no knead bread needs to sit in a Dutch oven for about 18 hours to rise enough. It is a kind of bread that is best when you just leave it alone and let it happen, and then bake it. I mean, baking in general is an entire becoming process, right? But it's not just gardening and baking and ministry and snakeskin that have a process. I'm a process-oriented person in general, and I've learned that the process is the point more often than not, rather than the destination or the completion of something. It is the process that is the becoming. Resmaa Menakem, in his book, My Grandmother's Hands, which I heartily commend to you if you've not read it, talks about our need to metabolize our trauma, to integrate the feelings and grow into our healing. In his book, he's speaking specifically about generational trauma, but he does also relate it back to the trauma of our own lives. And I think about this process often and that idea of metabolizing things, integrating them into our bodies, and the need to metabolize feelings. On Inauguration Day this past January, all of the tension and stress I'd been holding in my body since January 6th, when the insurrection or storming the Capitol, whatever you want to call it, happened, it nearly evaporated, right? As President Biden was sworn in. It didn't evaporate though. What happened was I had a rapid metabolization of cortisol, which is the stress hormone. That's not just a metaphor. The metabolizing is not just a metaphor. I did actually metabolize cortisol, and it's a physiological process, and it was exhausting. I took a nap at like 12:30 on Inauguration Day because once it was over, I was exhausted. My point with all of these process metaphors is that we need to take the time to become. We need to metabolize and slither and rise. We can be patient with our plants and our bread. We demonstrate that over and over again. Let's transfer that patience to our hearts and souls as we shed skin or heal and grow. The contents of becoming may be different, but the needs for time and patience are the same. In order to become the best version of ourselves, we need to shed the older versions. And then we need to do it again. We must live through the discomfort of growth, even though we know emotional growth can be some of the toughest living we ever do. The stress, though, like the snake going through the stress of shedding its skin, it's worth it and it's necessary. Becoming could be as simple as changing our nail color if we're a person who paints our nails, but it's often not. It's more like growing new fingernails altogether. Sorry if that's a little gruesome for anybody, but I would be doing a disservice to you and to the discussion about becoming if I didn't also acknowledge that it's messy and maybe it's gross sometimes. I asked my partner what she thought of when she heard the word becoming. And one of the first things that she said was, it gets messy before it gets clean. I actually thought about trying to find a way to talk about just that messiness for this talk today. But as it turns out, I had a lot more to say about becoming than just that, even though I probably could have done it if I'd have really decided to. I do like the idea of the requirement of messiness in becoming. And I'm a fan of undertaking the messiness. To be clear, I don't want to stay in the messiness, but as a process-oriented person, I've learned that the messy parts are not to be avoided. The becoming is incomplete if we do. If we don't throw flour down on the bench when we make bread, the bread will stick and fall apart. If the snake doesn't rub their head on a rock and make a mess, they won't be able to get the old skin off. If we avoid getting our hands dirty, gardening will be a lot less fruitful. I recently saw a meme that said, all of the magic is waiting for you on the other side of the work you're avoiding. All of the magic is waiting for you on the other side of the work you're avoiding. Now, I don't think the work in question here is filing paperwork or digging a ditch. The work is staying in the discomfort of our old skin while it separates from the top and bottom of each scale until we can wriggle out of it and leave it behind. The work is metabolizing our trauma, moving from hurt to healing, and like the snake, doing it again when the time comes. You see, growing is a never-ending process. The snake knows that. Becoming is our work to do. We become the next version of ourselves because we've learned more, or we feel differently, or we finally understand what that voice has been telling us to do. Becoming and becoming again is the most direct path to living authentically. Every day we become more ourselves. Now, I was myself 20 years ago, even though I was a totally different person than I am now. I've gone through many iterations of my authentic self in that time. We all do, if we're willing and open. Just like the snake outgrows its skin, even though that skin has been just fine for the last few months. The version of myself I was 20 years ago was not bad or wrong. It was the version of myself I was capable of being, given what I knew about life and my environment, what I needed to be at the time. A lot of the ways I moved through the world then wouldn't work for me anymore. For starters, when I was 20 years ago, I didn't have any children. I do now. And that right there is enough to make the version of myself of 20 years ago incompetent at my life now. But there are other things, other ways I have grown in the last 20 years that have brought me to this place. And I had to be that version of myself to get to this version. The snake has to be in the old skin before it can be in the new skin. One necessarily predates the other. So you haven't done the hard work. Okay. Give yourself a break. You are the version of you that you can be right now. The version of you that is coping with a pandemic and late stage capitalism is a pretty great version of you. And it is the version of you that is still getting to church on Sunday, even though it's on your screen instead of in person. And that is the version that I know and the version that I have grown to call and know as beloved. Let us become beloveds. Do the work. Take the time. May it be so. Amen.